So, good afternoon. I'm Amanda Brock. I'm CEO of Open UK, and I'm really pleased to be with you. You've done very well in finding this session because it wasn't on the calendar until first thing this morning, so I wasn't expecting anyone to be here, so well done. I don't know, some of you might have met me last year when I spoke in the main room, and I've tried to cut down anything that I think repeats that, but there'll be a couple of little bits that might overlap with it. So if you don't know, I'm the CEO of Open UK. We're an industry organisation. We are a very specific organisation a unique organisation in as much as we bring together the open source community and we do policy work. So I think other organisations sort of do one or the other. And our focus is UK leadership in open tech, so software, hardware, data, standards and AI. But we adjusted that focus from a UK inward-looking focus to UK leadership and global collaboration very quickly after we set the organisation up. So fundamental to everything we do is this concept of working with everybody across open source. Personally, I used to be a lawyer and I edited this book. If anybody is interested in it, the QR code will take you through to an open access version. And I think it says a lot about the change that we've all been looking at in the last few years, that when we published this, we didn't include AI because we didn't think AI was relevant to open source in 2022, 23. I guess we started working it a few years before, but things have really shifted, and it's that change that I'm going to focus on today. I spend a lot of my time travelling, talking. I'm writing for the tech press. Hi. But I also get to do a lot of research, and that research has meant that in the UK we probably have data that no other country in the world has got about our open source communities and contributions. And as of last year, we were sitting at GitHub accounts of 4.1 million across the UK. It's a very flawed measure, but it's the measure that everybody uses for a number of open source developers. That 4.1 million translates into 6% of the UK population, which is higher per capita than any country in the world. So if you look at somewhere like the US or India, they've got many, many more obviously, but per capita they don't meet that level. So I've been really fortunate to spend the last 5 years leading an organisation with a huge pool or contributor base around open source, looking at the work they do and trying to influence the UK to have better policies around open tech. Now, Andrew Waffer, who didn't come to the session, I note, has suggested the title about navigating change in software and AI in the last few years. So I'm going to split this into sort of three key areas. I'm going to run you through the world of change that we've all been living in from a sort of political and policy perspective. I'm going to think a bit about software and AI in the last couple of years and what's happened there and what we've got to contend with, and then leave you with a few thoughts on where this is all going. So this is probably where you expect anything in 2025 that's talking about change to start and focus. And we'll come back to him because he's obviously super relevant for everything tech. But actually, this started really 10 years ago. And Ursula von der Leyen, President of the European Union in 2019, was talking about digital sovereignty. She was talking about changes being witnessed that were going to impact the future, our children's future, and that actions in 2019 were going to determine the world that we were going to be living in the EU. Hi, come in. Can I sit down? 2019 wasn't the start, and actually this photo is from 2020. And it relates, as many of you will realise, to Brexit, which was voted for, I think, in 2016. I know I was living in Amsterdam at the time. This is actually outside the European Commission on the 31st of January 2020. We were at FOSDEM, and we went to the Commission, and at midnight, I don't know if they do this every night, but at midnight they turned the lights out on us. And it felt really symbolic. And for me, when we talk about political impact on policy and geopolitics, I don't think there could be a more significant moment, because you can take it to the second when the UK left the European Union, and it felt like that was having a huge impact on us and a huge shift, not just in our day-to-day lives, but in things like collaboration. So if I'm completely candid with you, to this day, the European Commission will not let me or anybody from Open UK speak at an event. We used to moderate, we used to speak all the time, but they'll never forgive us. You know, our parents had a messy divorce and we were being punished. And that, for me, goes to the heart of what open source is about, what tech's about, what digital's about. And it's why I started talking about this sort of geopolitical stuff 5 or 6 years ago. And of course, it just got bigger and went on. So we went from the UK leaving, and when the UK left, I should also share with you, most people don't realise Germany at the same time was considering it. And Germany, instead of taking this drastic measure that our politicians took, had a court case where they established that German law had precedence over European law. And that was how they got this sovereignty feeling back, whereas we went the full hog. So you then look at what happens across the EU and beyond, and you see China and the EU in friction during lockdown. You see the US and China in friction, and you see the UK and China in friction as they rip the Huawei infrastructure out of the UK mobile networks. Something that we'll never know whether it really needs to be done. Now, only yesterday there was a UK-US trade deal which we've been negotiating since Brexit. And there was pushback from China, and the pushback was that the UK and US have agreed to work together on security. Now, it doesn't mention any specific country, but it raises this question and this concern for China, that they may be being excluded in digital, in AI, in the future of tech by these two countries colluding or working together. I use colluding advisedly because trade deals aren't meant to be about a third party. They're meant to be about the countries that are involved in them, and they're not meant to impact others or directly intend to. So we're seeing all of these complicated shifts going on in the landscape that we live in, and they don't just apply in our political lives and in our policy lives. They apply also at a level of the state, of the citizen beyond the state. So we saw Black Lives Matter. We saw young people campaigning around COP26 and the environment. And then we've almost seen a pendulum swing back against that since the start of the year. Now, I think a war probably is the ultimate geopolitical friction and shift, right? And there are many more wars and frictions happening across the planet since the war in Ukraine broke out. Obviously, it's quite close to home for us. Obviously, it's at the centre of a lot of friction now. There were a lot of engineers and developers there, which also led to people looking at how we dealt with Russia in terms of open source collaboration. There was a lot of pushback around whether or not we should put restraints into code so that Russians couldn't use it, so that how it could be used was going to be restricted. And that, again, undermines the essence of what open source is about, which is this global collaboration. And this isn't going anywhere. I was asked to share this with you. This is a young 29-year-old Ukrainian open source contributor whose home was hit last week. He's in hospital, he can't walk, and his kidneys aren't working. His wife was killed in the attack, and they're raising funds for him. They've got to half of what they need. They need 11,000 for him just to get him through the time he's in hospital. So I promised I would share this. But this, I think, helps us all to understand that this change, this shift that we're all navigating is a reality. It's not something that some woman's standing talking to you about in a room in Lisbon while we're all in a conference. This is actually the reality of the infrastructure that you are all contributing to, and things that are impacting on it on a day-to-day basis beyond your technological decisions. So getting back to the beginning of this year, nobody could have predicted. One or two people might have been able to predict. Few people could have predicted where we've ended up post-Trump's inauguration. Obviously, tariffs have caused huge friction and huge concern. Now, this is something that I think is really important for our digital and our technological futures. Currently, software isn't covered by the tariffs, whatever level of tariff applies to you. But Canada was probably the first country to be affected, really affected. And what they saw there was that although software wasn't covered by the tariffs, there was a massive decline. I think it was around 20 to 30% in a short space of time in contracts for software support. And people were concerned that even if the software could flow, that there was going to be an issue around support, around services over time. We've seen the European Commission blur the lines by making software a good, making it a product and not a service. So there's all sorts of shifts going on that could affect our ability to collaborate and our ability to move software across borders and to contribute to each other's code. And I think the tariffs piece, and for our businesses to expand and develop as well. But I think this is a really important context to have around geopolitics as we think about how we navigate change. I'm going to do software because it's quicker, I think, than AI. And I'm trying to get through this fast enough that maybe we can open it up to the room and have a bit of a Q&A and discuss some of the topics. Open source was adopted at such a pace that the scale of adoption was not matched by scale of understanding. And you'll all see that in your everyday lives, right? People use open source, they don't really understand what they're doing with it, they want to contribute, they don't know how, they run it in businesses, they don't know what skills they need to bring in. They do the same in the public sector. I put this couple of slides in almost every deck I do because I think it's so important. And we go back to what is open source. So for me, it's a software that meets the open source definition. There are 10 points to that definition. Nobody knows all 10, but the people who do the checking of licenses go back to this and check the licenses against it. For me, 5 and 6 are what matters. Anyone can use the code for any purpose. And that means that anything that has a geographical restriction in a license will stop the code being open source. And I think we have to remember that as we see things evolve. Now, what we're used to seeing is commercial friction. We're used to seeing companies shifting away from open source. This is very disingenuous. When Elastic did this, they were implying that they were doubling down on open and being more open, and in fact they were moving away to a non-open source license, because it had a friction in it that stopped commercialization. Elastic have come back into the fold this year. They've moved back to an open source license. Redis, who also moved away, has also come back into the fold using AGPL, although I think there's a lot of suspicion about their movement back and forwards. Last year there was quite a lot of work done to show that when companies have moved away from open source licensing, they ostensibly do it to make more money. It's not that they're not making money, but they believe by moving away from the open source license, having commercial restrictions, that they're able to make more. But there's no proof at the moment that they do, and it looks like they probably don't. So we've seen Elastic, we've seen Redis coming back into pure open source licensing. I think there's a lesson from all that commercial shift, and the lesson is that we're actually looking at more kinds of software. And when we look at policymakers who often use the term open source, when they're talking about software, they're really talking about something that's open. They're not talking about something that meets the standard that we think of in open source, which is that anybody can use it for any purpose. So they don't hold the software and the providers accountable to the same standard. I think the reality is that we've got to a situation where we've got 3 kinds of software, and there are various moves afoot. Sentry have been doing a lot of work on this to try and create a 3rd category. Personally, I have no problem with that. I think it's maybe not a bad thing, because at least it calls out what it is, and then people won't be disingenuous. They won't pretend something's open source when it's not. But when they do, it's open washing. Now, I never ever thought that my nerdy interest in open source would end up being something that was on The Economist, The New York Times, and other major publications. But open washing has become such a big deal, this concept of not meeting the standards of open source, partly through the AI conversation, that we've actually seen it enter the mainstream. And I think part of the reason for this isn't just companies being naughty. It's not companies trying to make more money. I think part of it is generational. And often, not just in open source, when you have a generation that are the founders of something, they're passionate believers and they understand what it is they believe in. So for me, this is not about age, this is about how you got into open source. And what I see is that Gen 1 tends to be people who are ideologically attached to the open source values. Gen 2, as with many things in open source, tends to be people who've come to the technology first. They've found out about the output rather than the belief system, rather than the battles that have been fought to get there. And they engage on the technology and then later find out about those values. And it's definitely not age. I have somebody on my board who's a year younger than me, and she's definitely Gen 2. You know, she's somebody who's come quite late in life to open source and only got into it because of Kubernetes. And you can sort of see the flow in the kinds of open source people have worked on and how their belief system has been structured and which generation they fit into. And I think Gen 3 is very much about AI in the future, things like quantum. So when we look at AI, a year ago we were seeing in the press this battle raging about what open source AI is. And I guess I've been a little bit controversial in this discussion because I don't think we should be defining it. And I don't think we should define it for lots of different reasons. One being that open source software has a meaning, that we all know what it is, it's long established, and I think creating a second definition using those words open source undermines it. The OSI have produced a definition that's had very limited take-up. The FSF are now working on their own version of this with slightly different criteria. That will make some people who don't like the OSI definition happy because it's a different set of values being applied, but it won't fix my problem, which is I don't think we should be doing this in the first place. I think we should be looking at the different components in open source, the different components in AI. So what is it that makes up AI? Weights, models, software, algorithms, data, and what happens to those if they're fully open, partially open, or remain closed. And that's how you, from my perspective, you work out whether it's open or not and you assess risk. So this was done by Radboud University last summer. I think it's the best thing I've seen in this space. So they broke it into 14 components and then they surveyed against, I think, 40 different LLMs. And in many ways, this is very last year, right? Because we're talking about LLMs and to a large extent, LLMs and training. And what we saw through 2024 was this myth of open source AI really evolving. And that started in 2023 with ChatGPT-4. And the misnomer that is OpenAI has been the problem. If we had access to that term, OpenAI, we would all be talking about OpenAI rather than open source AI. Unfortunately, OpenAI, which is not open at the moment, took the trademark in this and has stopped us all being able to use it. And this is the heart of the problem. And Elon Musk agrees with me. Elon was involved in founding this. He was involved in building what he thought was going to be an open source foundation. Of course, OpenAI has moved away from that very quickly, but they may be coming back to the fold, and we'll get back to that in a minute. So then we see by, I think, February, March 23, access to Llama. Now that was shared on a license that wasn't open source. It was shared on a license restricted to usage for academics, which was then leaked. And that leak meant that the open source community suddenly got access to AI and were able to start to build on that. Now, technically, they shouldn't have been there. They don't have the license or the right to use it, but they were doing it. And very quickly, we saw the big techs, Google and the likes, recognizing this is not official party line, this is a leaked memo, one person's opinion from Google, but this was the sentiment. We have no moat. And a moat for a big tech company would be their IP that stops other people doing things. Now, they weren't able to differentiate themselves enough that they felt that companies would pay for their products when you compare them to what was happening in the open. And by July of 2023, we see Meta formally sharing Llama 2 in a way that was there for the open source community. Now, it's still not open source, and you'll see OpenUK's logo there. We made a decision, and I'd read all of the documents as an ex-lawyer. We made a decision that this was a good thing. It was not open source. The Llama community license, which the software is shared on, has a commercial restriction in it. It has something that introduces friction to the ecosystem and the open source definition that can never be open source. And Meta very carefully didn't call it open source, and this is the commitment we signed up to, and it's around open innovation. And I completely stand by supporting this because I think this in history will go down as one of the biggest single shifts to openness, with one of the biggest impacts on the world that society will ever see. And as they launched it, unfortunately, Zuckerberg's launch announcement called it open source, and we get into this world of fighting about open washing and what open source means. But from my perspective, it didn't matter that it wasn't open source because it moved us in the right direction. And if it hadn't done that, we wouldn't have ended up with DeepSeek and with R1. So when we saw R1 in January, it was a distillation of llama, of quite apparently of other things, but that's not been proven. The openness that was llama enabled this technological shift, and this is at the heart of openness, right? The fact that we see something being shared, innovated on top of, iterated on, and then passed on to the next person is at the heart of what we do. Now, there was a lot of pushback because this came out of China, and remember, we're in this world of geopolitical shift. There was a lot of pushback, and I think Hugging Face were really interesting in the way they answered that. What they said was that whilst DeepSeek couldn't share the data from China that the model was trained on, what they did was provide detailed instructions. And within a week, R1 Open had been created by Hugging Face using French data and replicating the model, building their own model of French data or global data, showing that that the investment was worth it, that this community approach really made a difference. And the cost of an LLM went from 100 million in training to 5 million when R1 was launched. Now, again, people sometimes are never happy, and there was a lot of pushback about was it open source enough. DeepSeek really have made an effort, and they had this open source week where every day they shared another repository that was also open sourced of tools that they were using. And in March, I think this is probably as interesting, if not more, than R1, but most people missed it. And V3 is a non-reasoning model. R1 is a reasoning model. V3 had some significant technological shifts that mean that when the LLM runs, when you ask it a question, when it goes through inference, it doesn't use all of the parameters. So not only have you reduced the cost from like 100 million to 5 million, but you've created something which will run with part of the overall LLM, which previously wasn't happening. And what that means is that you're using less compute, you're losing less memory, less power, and that will have a significant difference. And I think that is why we saw a rapid release of GPT-5, and the rumoured next reasoning model, R2 or whatever they're going to call it, hasn't come out yet. Everybody was expecting that in April and it hasn't appeared. And I think, if we look at the context, Sam Altman and OpenAI really panicked when they saw R1. And by the 30th of January, this was on a Reddit Ask Me Anything, Altman was saying he was on the wrong side of history. Now, he caveated this by saying that this was not everybody in OpenAI's view, and that opening up a model wasn't a priority for OpenAI. I think a month ago, there was another statement from OpenAI saying that they will release an open source language model this summer, so we're expecting that in June. And I think they pushed ChatGPT-5 out to make it harder for R2 when it was released to be the preeminent LLM, and there was an expectation that R2 was going to be better than ChatGPT-4. So I think you see in this landscape lots of commercial competition, but also geopolitical competition and open versus closed competition. So going back to that piece that I started the AI conversation on, the definition of open source AI, there's still a lot of feeling that we need a definition, even if I don't agree. And certain circumstances show that that is right. One being the EU's AI Act, first piece of legislation on AI in the world that deals with LLMs and which talks about open source AI and gives exceptions for open source AI, calls it free and open source AI. So just this piece of legislation means that we do have to understand, for so long as this applies, how that's going to work. The same view hasn't been taken across the planet. And this is also part of the change that we need to deal with. When we look at something like AI, it's generally accepted that it would be better if our governance was global, if we were the same in every country. That is definitely not the case in AI. I think open source would have a good argument for being treated on the same basis, and it's definitely not the case in AI. In October 23, I think it was, we saw this executive order come out of the Biden administration, and if you looked for it in January, within a day or two of Trump's inauguration, it was gone. So you get a 404 message. Apparently the Constitution in America was in the same position, but if you went to the White House website and you looked up the executive order, this is what you got instead, and it's gone. It's just gone. But there will be another one apparently within 6 months. Who knows what it's going to say. China also has some legislation around AI. The UK does not. I was at the Global AI Summit the different governments had in February, and I think it's the first time that somebody who leads an open source organisation was invited. And that's partly because Macron has really been pushing the open source agenda in France. And what you saw was a difference between the EU, China and the US. And it might be surprising that China and the US were absolutely aligned. And they were absolutely aligned in saying, you can legislate if you want, we're going to ask for forgiveness later. And it was really, really clear that legislation was not going to be an inhibitor to their innovation and their growth in their countries, of their AI businesses and of their AI innovation. The UK was kind of absent from the conversation in many ways, and the EU seemed like the old man, you know, really with this very heavyweight, very bureaucratic approach to the regulation, which really can't keep up with the technology. And these summits started in the UK, I think 18 months ago, nearly 2 years ago now, 18 months ago. And they started with a focus on safety and security. And that has shifted dramatically. By Paris in February, we saw the focus being on action. We saw open weights, and we saw the debate. The debate about open source AI seems to have gone away at that level. Nobody was talking about open source AI. We saw 2 foundations launched with open source as their focus. This one, Roost, Kate and I were talking about it earlier, is a suite of tools that big techs have donated that help with governance around AI. Both Meta and Eric Schmidt were in the room launching it. There's 42 million being put into that one. The other one is the Current AI Foundation, which doesn't use the term open source because they want to cover data in a broader sphere. They've got 500 million on launch and are aiming to be at 5 billion in 5 years. And this is all part of what France is driving in its shift towards open source. I'm a bit disappointed. I was interviewed by the people who set those up, and what they're doing is utterly brilliant, and I'm a little bit jealous, I suppose. Back in May of last year, the UK opened up something called Inspect in our AI Safety Institute and our AI Security Institute. And Inspect is an evaluation platform. The goal was to have open sourced this, to build an ecosystem, and to see that become the de facto standard for more people to contribute to it. We saw the then Prime Minister standing behind open source, putting this out on LinkedIn. But he then resigned, an election was called, and we end up with the French Action Summit being where these big open source initiatives were launched. But I'll bet you didn't see any of them, because they're still a bit under the radar. And I think probably about 1 billion of the 8 billion that Macron announced at that summit is around open source. A couple of reports if you're interested. The middle one is obviously looking at that summit, and it has a lot more detail around those foundations and what they're going to do. The next summit again is impacted by change, and we have Modi in India leading it. He co-hosted the French one, and he's been very clear that we're shifting to talk about open source, and we're shifting to talk more and more about open source at these summits at a global political level, because he wants to talk about the global south and access. So where does this leave us? Well, if you look at the landscape in AI, what you see is the US and China, number 1 and 2, Singapore, the UK, France behind them, but the drop between the US and China and the rest is massive. You know, it's not a close race. In Europe, France is actually ahead of the UK when it comes to open source AI, depending on how you define it, obviously, but France has slipped ahead. We see on the software side, and I don't know how many of you will have seen this, there have been various initiatives in the last few months since Trump came to power to build a sovereign stack, to build software that's exclusive of the US. And every time you see these stacks, they'll say sovereign and then open source in the same sentence. And for me, it's a sort of juxtaposition, because it can't be sovereign if sovereignty means it's created here and open source, because open source is for everybody and globally collaborative. They definitely can't build a sovereign stack without open source. And I think the direction that some countries are driving us in, partly as a reaction to the US, but it was going on long before, is just not going to be good for global technology or their local technology. And I think that part of the reason we had the reaction we did from President Trump is their aggression around sovereignty. So I'm not excusing him, in case anyone thinks I'm excusing him, but some of it is actually understandable. This may be wrong. This is AI's explanation of what sovereignty is from a quick Google search, and it did have at the bottom, this may be wrong underneath it. And I think it is wrong, because I think it's politically wrong. I think it's insensitive, and I think it moves away from the basis of how we've all worked to evolve technology for the last 30 years in collaboration. The UK's taken a slightly different approach, and I'm no political animal or fan of any particular politician, but I think what Starmer's done is right. And instead of being aggressive and saying we have to make it here, he's gone in and tried to collaborate. I've written a couple of pieces about it, and yesterday we saw this member of the European Parliament. I'm slightly concerned that I'm now aligned with the right-wingers, which is not my natural place, but this is one of the right-wing members of the European Parliament who suggested the EU needs to sober up yesterday. For me, I would say get real. They need to start to understand that if you fork technology to build your own stack and try to manage your own branches, you're really going to be on a highway to nothing. And I go back to Modi's comment about access and creating both AI and software that have access for all. The shift that we've seen in OpenAI, now talking about genuinely opening things up. And we will carry this discussion on if any of you are around and want to come to London next year at State of OpenCon. But I think what we're seeing is a very difficult environment to navigate, partly through just the circumstances of the last few years and partly through the geopolitics that we're all living through now. I've gone over time, you're not really going to get much of a discussion. Am I allowed any questions? Yeah? If anybody wants to talk about any of it or ask any questions, go okay.
What's your perspective on the open?
I think you have to...
Oh, okay. Just wondering if you've got what your perspective is on the OpenMDW license and how that might play into this.
I don't know what it is. What is it?
It's a license for models and software systems that's
For
starting
what,
to
sorry?
emerge. It's coming out of the LF's AI and data set with Dolan and company. If you haven't seen it yet.
Seen it.
Okay.
So I can't
So that-
comment. Anybody else who
Open-
knows it might want to
MDW.
comment.
I don't know how to. I know what I want to
If
ask.
you
I don't
can't
know.
see on camera, he's looking at the mic in a way it's like, oh well, I might as well.
No, I want to ask a question, but it's quite a complicated
That's all
question,
right,
I think,
the
so
whole
I'll try
thing
my
is
best.
complicated.
But given the lack of openness of LLMs
Yeah.
and they're being trained with open source code and not open source code that's been leaked and things like that, and you could argue whether the licenses have been complied with in that training. Is it fair use and all that, and then code's being generated using
Yeah.
those AI tools and going to
Yeah.
find their way into the open source code bases. What does that mean for open source licensing in general?
I can give
Does
you
it-
quite a
does it-
simple answer actually. I don't think we're asking the right question, complicated or simple. I think that we need to stop focusing on the copyright aspects of it, because actually if an LLM is doing what it should, it won't be directly copying and it won't be spitting out a copy. what it will be doing is learning the way a human would learn and then building on that. And I think what we ought to focus on is not governing, not creating legislation about it, but finding tools, like the work that Roost is doing, bringing these tools together, finding tools that enable good practice. In effect, it's building the de facto standards that open source has always been. And I think that's what we should focus on, because a lot of these other legal and technical problems will go away if we fix the governance through tooling. Does that make sense?
Okay, yeah, probably.
It's probably not what you expect a lawyer to say, right? And I also think with the copyright stuff, it's just so out of sync across the planet. There's so many different countries doing things different ways, and as a pragmatist, the ship has sailed. You're not going to stop LLMs doing that now. What's better is to hold them to a standard of good practice that people then want to
I think
use.
I agree with that, but earlier you divided things into three. There's open source code that follows the open source definition. There's stuff that doesn't. I'm saying there's probably only going to be two, isn't it? It's either open or it's closed. Does it matter what the terms of the open source license mean anymore?
I don't know. I've never thought about it like that. I think it matters in as much as you want to hold that standard true, even in the outputs of the LLM. Should it produce something that is going to be freely available and open, you want it to also meet that standard, so you don't have the commercial friction like you have with Meta and Llama.
Indeed, it should meet the very broad definition.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is, does it matter whether you've got a GPL or an MIT or BSD? That's what I'm.
Well, they have different consequences, but that'd be a whole licensing session, and I'm not the licensing nerd that everybody thinks I probably thinks I am. Anybody else have anything? Yeah. I'm happy. So if you want to leave, also feel free to leave. I'm happy to stay here and just talk to people.
So one question about this push for open source AI. How effective is that, for instance, for enabling access to the global south, is if actually a major constraint is actually resources like hardware, it's very expensive to train, things like that. So how to address that part of the thing?
I'm specifically very interested in this. So I just joined a board of an organisation that puts payment platforms into Africa that are open source payment platforms, Mojalo. And I went to Ghana, so it's the first time that I've been in Africa proper. And it's quite shocking because fundamentally it has the issues that we had 20, 30 years ago around connectivity, right? So a lot of things could have happened much faster if we'd had connectivity that was decent earlier. And when you look at the scale of some of these countries, part of the reason economically they've not grown is the countries are so big and you're trying to build infrastructure across these vast spaces. And I think there's some interesting work, because I've been looking at this. There are people doing things like building data centers in a cupboard with new operating systems that are super lean, that allow it to have more impact across that connectivity building. And I think the devices are potentially less of an issue than getting that infrastructure in place. I think the devices come because they don't have to be the top of the range. There's the opportunity to recycle. If we also look at things like technology refresh and data centers, you're avoiding all of that by using these really simplistic structures. I didn't know this, but I was told there are 7 data centers in Africa just now. And obviously the hyperscalers are all looking at where that's going to evolve. But I also think those markets have an opportunity. And I was listening to people from their financial institutions talking about how they were going to build open source out, and they don't know what they're talking about, right? But no government in the world at this point in time, to my mind, has done this well. No public sector has achieved this well. And what those countries have is the opportunity to learn, and they learn that making a law or putting a policy in place is not going to achieve that goal, right? You actually have to have the processes, you have to go into the detail of how this is going to work and start to build it and really do it to make that change. And I think they will have an advantage where they could potentially have much more open source adoption, because that's what's going to make the difference. It's that give a man a fish and he has a meal, teach him to fish. We are so far from being able to teach them to fish right now, because of the connectivity. But if that starts to scale, then I think Africa and some of the other global south countries really have an opportunity to build and to create that access. So I think Modi's right that keeping that access high up the agenda is absolutely critical. Makes sense, yeah. Anybody else? We're good? I think we're going to get thrown out. Thank you very much for your questions and your patience. I'll probably see you again next year, I believe. Thank you.